Hello, I'm Andy Agapangelo, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. We're a certified social enterprise, and we have a formal mission statement. Our mission is all about promoting ongoing reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. We began our endeavours back in 2015, and since that time, we've become increasingly concerned about the conduct within parts of the financial services sector. There are different bits of the financial services sector that seem to have a very, very high predisposition to misbehave. Many of you will know that we're big fans of Violation Tracker. If you look at the Violation Tracker data, I'll put a link to it in the chat shortly. If you look at the Violation Tracker data, you will see that of all the industries in the UK, the one that is most violating in terms of fines against it for malpractice, malfeasance, misconduct, mis-selling, and so on, is the financial industry. And that just doesn't make sense, folks, because the financial sector of all industries is the one that is most dependent upon being trustworthy. And if you analyze the data, you will find that the financial sector's malpractice is frankly dominated by household name banks. Surely they can't be very proud of the infringements record. And that really is what brings us all together on this Tuesday evening, UK time, talking about the Business Banking Resolution Service, which was set up supposedly in an attempt to fairly sort compensation, redress, justice to those individuals who have suffered as a consequence of the malpractice, malfeasance, misconduct, and mis-selling by the banks. And one of the things that continues to amaze me about the whole BBRS situation is that there really isn't any dispute at all that these business owners were very, very seriously harmed by the banking conduct that they became the victims of, despite the fact that it's very clear that they were on the receiving end of bad advice, mis-selling, fraudulent conduct, call it what you like. Despite the fact that that's all quite obvious, many years later, they are still having to fight for compensation and justice. What makes the timing of today's event particularly apt is, of course, that this time last week, just a week ago, there was a debate in the House of Commons about the Business Banking Resolution Service, where various parliamentarians made their thoughts very well known that they, like us, consider the Business Banking Resolution Service to be a failure, certainly in terms of the amount of cases sorted compared to the amount that were originally anticipated for being sorted. Tonight has a particular purpose, and that's in relation to the inquiry that has been opened by the Treasury Committee. I'm going to share my screen to bring a particular point to life. So here we go. We're going to go to the letter that the Transparency Task Force organised and was very, very proud to have so many people co-sign it. This is the letter that, as you can see, we sent to Harriet Baldwin MP in her capacity as the chair of the Treasury Committee back in March 2023. It seems like a lifetime ago. The letter basically says, for these sensible reasons, we would please like your committee to open an inquiry on SME finance. And one of the issues here is the point made that I've highlighted. Commenting in January 2019 on plans for the BBRS's creation, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond, wrote to Stephen Jones, Chief Executive of UK Finance, to state that if it transpires that the scheme is not bringing resolution to a meaningful number of complaints, I would expect there to be further discussion around the scope of and eligibility for the backward-looking scheme. And I'm sure that one of the things you're going to be hearing tonight is the efforts by various people to try to get the BBRS to change its ways, to improve its eligibility criteria, and to actually bring about a resolution to a meaningful number of cases. You'll also see here that we highlighted We write to request that the Treasury Committee launches a new investigation into the issue of SME finance, and in particular into the topics of misconduct, regulation and redress for SMEs mistreated by banks. I mentioned this just now. We are genuinely proud and very, very grateful for the huge amount of support that was shown for this endeavour to get the inquiry opened. As you can see, various organisations were happy to put their name to this. And we also had Mark Bishop and Nish Kotecha, Mark and Nish being on the SME liaison panel, so having a very close inside view on what was going on within the BBRS. They were happy to sign this. We also had some parliamentarians. When we got to 5, 6, 7, I was pleased, but look how many we got. All these parliamentarians were happy to put their name to a letter formally requesting that the Treasury Committee open an inquiry. And you must ask yourselves, why were they so happy to do that? Well, I bet you it's this. They are probably being continuously approached by their constituents who, after years and years and years, are still battling to get compensation and redress from the banks, many of whom, of course, will have been remarkably disappointed with the performance of the Business Banking Resolution Service. Various folks from the House of Lords, and of course, lots of individuals from overseas, and many, many other victims of banking misconduct, as you can see. I'm going to quickly scroll through this because it's such a long list, but I just wanted to take the opportunity to remind ourselves that this was a valiant effort. We organised it really well. I say we, I'm talking here about my colleagues Alexandra and Chelsea, who organised and managed all this. And when we had the news quite recently that the inquiry had actually been opened, we were naturally, absolutely over the moon with the result. Because what that does is that it gives us an opportunity to submit evidence to a parliamentary body. And I know that many of you are itching to do that. You want to tell your story. Many of you feel quite rightly that you have not been listened to fairly or respectfully even by the Business Banking Resolution Service. I know that many of you tell me that you feel as though the Business Banking Resolution Service has done basically all it can to find reasons to not progress your cases. That's what I'm being told on a very, very frequent basis. So here we have it, folks, the inquiry. This is the Treasury Select Committee's website, inquiry on SME finance. And the deadline is the 13th of August. In a moment, I'm going to be telling you about a specific Transparency Task Force event we've organised just to make sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of responding to this consultation. I'll get to that in a minute, but what I want to do is draw your attention to this next bit, because it's right down here that we give ourselves the opportunity, or that we've been given the opportunity to actually talk about our experience of the Business Banking Resolution Service. I just need to find the right bit, bear with me. Here we go. Here's the question. How effective has the Business Banking Resolution Service been, and what lessons can be learned from it? Ladies and gentlemen, I genuinely believe that that question gives us tremendous scope to say what we want to say through the submissions that you can put to the Treasury Select Committee, and go for it. We should all seize the opportunity to do that, whether you're personally somebody that's experienced the BBRS, or you simply want to add your voice to the call for highlighting its inadequacies. It doesn't really matter to me. Transparency Task Force will most certainly be preparing a submission. We will have ours done in time for the event that I referred to just now. This is it, folks. Tuesday, August the 8th, an event on Zoom, Tuesday, August the 8th, 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m, a TTF event all about responding to the Treasury Committee's inquiry on SME finance, the BBRS. And of course, we can use that opportunity to talk about the sorts of things that ought to be included in your submissions, etc., etc. I know that this is something that Mark Bishop is going to be picking up on. Campaigning is tough. It's often a bit like working your way through a desert. You go for a long period of time without getting anything nice happening. And just once in the blue moon, every occasionally, things really do come together. And that certainly seems to be the case as far as this endeavour is concerned. Could I please therefore ask us to do two things simultaneously? One, whilst welcoming Mark Bishop to the rostrum, as it were, and two, please also put your hands together for the collective endeavour that's been underway so far to get this inquiry opened. It's not easy to do that. We all had to work very hard. We all had to be about this in a very organised way, and we got the ball in the back of the net in terms of the inquiry. The next stage, of course, is how to turn the inquiry into real meaningful change, and that's what the event on the 8th of August is all about. Alexandra has very kindly just put a link to book yourselves onto that meeting. Please do. It's obviously a complimentary session as well, because it is another TTF event that's covering a matter that is most certainly a major public interest issue. So please do put your hands together, A, for Mark, who's going to be speaking soon, and B, to pat ourselves on the back for what we've managed to do collectively so far. Thank you very, very much indeed. You would not believe the amount of work that's been conducted by a long list of volunteers, plus Alexandra and Chelsea, to make that happen. I do hope that sets the scene really nicely. We're going to go to Mark Bishop, and then we're going to be going to Scott, and then we're going to go to Steve Middleton, and then Richard Samuel, Ned Beale. And as I say, we should be wrapping up at roughly 7:30. Mr. Mark Bishop, thank you very much, not just for talking now, but for all the many things that you do. Mark Bishop, over to you, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Andy. My intention is to share screen with you. Okay, thank you. So what I'm going to focus on is really what needs to happen next. And there's a reason for that, which I'm going to come to in the next slide. And it's this piece of advice, I think, from Art of War: fight the next battle, not the last. I was looking back at the Treasury Committee's original inquiry, which was in 2017-18, about SME finance. And what I noticed is that SME stakeholders absolutely rightly talked about, how appalling RBS GRG was, HBOS Reading, IRHPs, all of those things. What they didn't talk about, perhaps as much as they might have done, is what remedies they wanted. They talked a little bit about how they thought that tribunals would be a good thing, some reservations they had about another scheme that might be run by the banks, and maybe a little bit about, concerns about the Financial Ombudsman Service. But this was really a little bit at the edges. It wasn't the core of what they were talking about. What they were talking about was the last battle rather than the next. In contrast, the banks, the FCA, and the Treasury were all focused on the next battle. They were basically saying, we understand that there has been historical misconduct. We've got that, that's fine, we don't dispute it, and we want to put it right. And the way we want to put it right is via an arbitration scheme, and it happens that that might be operated and funded by the banks. And because the SME stakeholders were perhaps not as, they were perhaps more interested in, absolutely rightly, talking about past injustices, they didn't absolutely focus in on that and say, this is totally unacceptable. Here is why that's not the right solution. This is why we need tribunals. So basically, the banks were able to get away with it again. The BBRS historical scheme died in February, 14th of February, Valentine's Day. There's no dispute about that. The contemporary one is almost certain to do the same on the 31st of December. The reason why we know that is when they closed down the SME liaison panel, they made the tactical error, because they had to do it in a big hurry, of putting out a release that said, we are bringing it forward from the 31st of December. There are only two circumstances under which they could close it. The first is a closure of the overall scheme, and the second is agreement between the panel chair and the board that it would be good to close it sooner. Of course, there was no panel chair once Anthony Townsend resigned, so they couldn't have such an agreement on the 31st of December. Therefore, the only thing that could have been happening on the 31st of December is closure of the scheme. And we also know, of course, that the scheme is funded until the end of December. So basically what they did was they made the mistake of telling us that the whole thing closed down on 31st December. So from this point onwards, we are not fighting the BBRS. We know it's going to die anyway. What we should be fighting is for what happens to replace it. And the Treasury Committee's inquiry into SME finance is the opportunity, I believe, for SME stakeholders to make that case. It's probably the only opportunity you're going to get, and you can bet your bottom dollar that already bank lobbyists and Treasury officials are whispering in the ears of members of the Treasury Committee about why actually the Financial Ombudsman Service is the perfect solution. If you have any doubt of that, I have two pieces of evidence for you. The first one, and there's a link in my presentation, I'm sure that Alexandra will send it around tomorrow. The first one is that the FCA is already consulting on an expanded version of the FOS. That's their plan. The second one is, if you read the backbench, the Westminster Hall debate that happened last week about the BBRS, the Economic Secretary to the Treasury made the case for the Financial Ombudsman Service being the solution. And perhaps most worrying, more worrying than that, his shadow, the shadow Economic Secretary to the Treasury, Tulip Siddiq, she did exactly the same thing. Now, let's be honest, how many of us here would bet on the Conservatives winning the next general election? Even if you are a Conservative, activist party member, I don't think that you would be putting a lot of money on that outcome. So Tulip Siddiq will be the Economic Secretary to the Treasury this time next year, maybe in the autumn, but certainly by the end of next year. And she wants, at the moment, tribunals. So the battle that we need to be fighting is not to say, the BBRS is not quite as independent as it might be. We don't like the bank appointment. All those things are true and they're relevant, but the battle that will determine the outcome is who wins about whether it's the Financial Ombudsman Service or tribunals that determine these disputes in the future.
Mark, I'm just going to cut in there. I think you said accidentally that the shadow wants tribunals. I think you meant to say she was keen on the FOS.
Yes, I apologise. That's absolutely right. She publicly said the FOS. If I said tribunals, I apologise. That was not her position. So, she's clearly already captured by the banks, and the Labour Party wants to appear to be absolutely city friendly, and she is signalling that she is no threat to them. And I'm sure that the donations will roll in as party conference time comes round in the autumn. So, in fact, what we should be trying to do is to get ahead of the enemy, capture the high ground. So it's really important that everybody here who has a view about this matter responds to the Treasury Committee's call for evidence about SME finance. Andy, it showed you the list of questions, and the key one was, about has the BBRS been a success and what lessons should be learned? And in that, I would say spend 10% of your time at the most on the first half of the question and 90% as a minimum on the second half. You can talk about why it failed, but the numbers speak for themselves. There's no real dispute that it failed. What really matters is what lessons can be learned from it. But also look at the other questions that there are there, particularly in the section that deals with regulatory matters. You'll notice that there's only one question about the BBRS, but there are actually two questions about the Financial Ombudsman Service. So it's really important to set out in detail why the Financial Ombudsman Service is not the answer. You'll also notice there are no questions, there are 0 questions about tribunals. Very often, when there is bias, for example, in the media, it's not the use of language, it's not, the choice of experts and any of those kinds of things, because that stuff's very visible. The most insidious bias is what you're not hearing at all. So there's no question about tribunals. That tells you which way this thing is going at the moment. Something that I've learned over the years is that the Secretariat or the Clerk's Office to the Treasury Committee has only a couple of full-time staff, people who are on Parliament's payroll. But what it does have is people seconded into it. I wonder if you can guess where they're seconded from. Well, typically there's somebody from the Bank of England, the Prudential Regulation Authority, which of course is part of the Bank of England, the Financial Conduct Authority, sometimes the people from UK Finance, basically the people that are trying to influence this in the direction of the banks. are the people who are writing these consultation exercises. We've learned this, Andy and I, over the years, we've even found out that the questions that are asked in evidence sessions by members of the Treasury Committee, many of those are drafted by people in the clerk's office, which has all of those seconded people in. So don't just answer the questions that are there, also answer the questions that ought to be there, but aren't. And your views may differ from mine or from Andy's or from anybody else's, but we've got a session coming up on the 8th, which will talk about how to respond to the consultation. Obviously, that's quite close to the 13th, which is the deadline. So people will have to move quickly after that exercise, after that symposium. But in the meantime, think about what's wrong with the FOS. For example, it's not just about the eligibility criteria. There's also the question of what the cap is on awards. There's also the issue of how it operates. The complainant must first complain to the bank. So the bank knows everything about what your arguments are as why they should compensate you. They then give their response, but they don't have to disclose any documents to you as they would in civil proceedings. If you don't get the answer you want, you then escalate the matter to the ombudsman. And the ombudsman sees your complaint where you've thrown everything at it. They also see the response of the bank. But the bank doesn't have to disclose everything, only the stuff that's helpful to it. More concerning than that, you never get to see what the bank has said to the ombudsman, and you also never get to challenge it. So whereas they've been able to challenge your case, you've never been able to challenge theirs. So there is inequality and asymmetry built into this. I call it a black box adjudication system because only one party's side is seen, the other side is never seen and challenged. Another point you can make, it's about moral authority. SMEs were right last time. When SMEs last time said that tribunals were needed and that a bank-funded arbitration scheme wouldn't work, they were right. So they should be listened to now when they're saying that the ombudsman isn't the solution and that tribunals are needed. Also, a little detail that's very important to put in there is to say that tribunals have an Achilles heel. We should be honest about what it is, and we should say there's a need to deal with it. The easy way that, say, UK Finance, in briefing the politicians on the committee, can defeat tribunals while appearing to be impartial, public-spirited, even on our side, is to say many of these disputes are historical ones. Historical ones, a lot of them go back to either side of the global financial crisis. That's more than 6 years ago. The Limitation Act means that in no court-type process, including in the tribunals, can you hear these cases. They are time-barred. So what we'd have to say is they wouldn't normally be time-barred, but in the legislation that creates SME banking tribunals, they should novate the cases, certainly cases from what's known as the FISMA era. So since the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000 came into effect in 2002, since then, those cases should be novated to the day that the legislation comes in, and thereafter people have 6 years. So anticipate the objection and deal with it up front. So that Limitation Act is really important, and it goes to make the point that detail matters. As the cap on awards, one of the reasons why people didn't use the BBRS is if you had a business that was maybe worth £6 million balance sheet size and it failed 10 years ago, clearly being offered £600,000 or £350,000 or whatever it was is a derisory sum of money. Why would you have a cap on awards? The sum to be awarded should be the amount of money that was lost. Anything less than that is simply protecting the banks. There are also questions in there you'll see about whether SME lending should be brought within the regulatory perimeter. The answer to that question is surely yes. The only reason why it wouldn't be, and it was the reason that was advanced last time back in 2018, is, well, actually, if we were to do this, then it would become a lot harder for banks to justify lending to small businesses. Well, actually, that's bollocks. Excuse my language, but the reason why there are all these SME banking disputes is because all of this lending has been going on for years, whether it is firms that are within the regulated perimeter or not. if a firm is unincorporated and the loan is less than £25,000, then that loan is regulated. There are plenty of loans of that sort that take place all of the time. And indeed, not so long ago, I think it was last year, the FCA did a survey to find out how these loans were going, whether there was compliance by the banks with the lending standards and the regulations. And they found in a surprisingly high proportion, about 40% of these loans, there wasn't. So that tells you actually that there is still that kind of lending. So there is no argument, no evidence that says that there is a reason not to have it within the regulatory perimeter. There is a reason to do it, which is that Section 404 of the Financial Services and Markets Act would then apply. And that is a provision within the law that says that where there's a regulated activity and there are systemic breaches of regulations, the FCA can launch an industry-wide redress scheme. So instead of, for example, with IRHPs, where they would have had, if they'd gone down the enforcement route, they would have to create restitution orders, one for each bank. In this route, they would be able to create one for the whole industry. It's just less work for them and therefore less excuse for the FCA to do nothing. So that really is all I wanted to say. It's not a huge amount, a shorter presentation than usual, but I hope that you will find it helpful. If anybody disagrees with it, very happy to, or has questions, then very happy to deal with those either now or a bit later.
Mark, thank you very, very much indeed. As always, you set things out so clearly. One of the characteristics of this whole debate is there is a multiplicity of different views on different things. Not everybody is going to agree with everything that everybody else says. That's absolutely fine. That's all part of the healthy debate and discussion and the process of building consensus. But the key points are, we've now got an opportunity to put in a consultation response. Let's please, please, please not waste that opportunity. TTF will be making a submission. We'll have it ready by the time the event on the 8th of August happens. And of course, if you wanted to make use of some of the content we create and adapt it to suit your own circumstances, please feel free to do so. Does anybody have any initial comments or questions specifically relating to what Mark has just covered? If so, please raise your hand either digitally or literally, and I'll bring you in. Otherwise, we're going to go straight to Scott Henderson. Scott's going to be talking about his and his family's case. Nick Rogers, as briefly as you can, please. Nick, share with us your thought. Nice and succinct, Nick, okay? Nice and succinct. Thank you.
Well, my point is about the Limitation Act. I'm concerned that if, so in my case, I was quite happy to wait for the BBRS to get its act together. You know, it takes 4 or 5 years to get it sorted. If from the date when the BBRS was terminated, should not the Limitation Act kick in from that date? Because up until that point, I was quite happy to wait for the my case to be heard. But then once the BBRS was terminated, then I was basically stuffed. So I think the Limitation Act should actually come from the date when the BBRS was deemed unfit for purpose. That's all I've got to say.
Maybe can I come in here and just say, Nick, morally, I can see that point. Legally, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't advise you. There are some very good lawyers on this call, and I think they may be speaking later. I don't believe there's any basis in law for that, unfortunately. No, there's not any sense in which the BBRS is a statutory body or part of kind of the legal system. I think that as things stand, you know, the Limitation Act is in place. It is, as I understand it, and you know, again, I stress I'm no lawyer, it's a very unusual thing, would be a very unusual thing as things stand, to in any way kind of suspend or vary the Limitation Act so that tribunals could deal with legacy cases that are more than 6 years old. It would be an exceptional thing. Parliamentarians are going to push against it. Lobbyists from banks will be, you know, up in arms against it. But, you know, in the interest of natural justice, I think it has to be done. Whether it will be done or not, God only knows.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Nick. Andy Keats, you're next. Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, just a quick one. Mark, you were talking about people don't get to see what the bank says about them within the FOS. They should. And can't remember the name of the person now, but I can circulate it afterwards to Andy and he can circulate it out. Name whatever her name is, who runs the FOS, was interviewed by the Treasury Select Committee a couple of years ago, maybe. He said, of course, people should see exactly what the bank says, and that's the whole purpose of everything. So I got the transcript of it, wrote it all down, recorded what was going on, and I've used that with the FOS, and it's worked. And I can say that I've won 5 out of 6 cases with the FOS. And the last one being that the bank wrote off 689,000 quid's worth of it said I owed, and it wrote it off. And that was through the FOS. It was by using the tactic of saying, look, your boss says that you should share all the bank information. The bank don't come in with any information, you win the case.
Wow. Do you know, Andy, thank you. That's really useful information. I'm just going to say, I think others should try that as well. Who knows, it might work. I have seen cases where it hasn't worked, and there's an unfortunate legal loophole. And again, I stress I'm not a lawyer, so this is my layperson's understanding of it. And it goes like this. If you are a consumer complaining about the FOS, complaining to the FOS, I apologise, you can go to the firm or you can go to the FOS and you can say, here's my data subject access request, my DSAR, give me everything you've got about me. But when that happens about a banking dispute, they give you everything they've got about you, but not about the banking dispute, because what they say is, this is about an incorporated entity. You may be a director and a shareholder of this firm, and may have been that in the past. You may even have initiated this complaint. But the minute it becomes about a firm, it's no longer private data. Now, there are legal arguments going the other way that it is your private data. And one of the things that I'm sure you and I will recall, probably is worth relating here, about being one of the SME liaison panelists, we were always trying to get more data out of there about the cases. And they were always saying to us, we can't give it to you because there's such a small number of cases that actually we could accidentally identify the complainants, ignoring the fact that, of course, these are businesses that are complainants, and therefore it's not private data, and therefore any argument about privacy immediately goes out the window. So banks both believe and don't believe that business information about your business is private data, but from the point of view of DSARs, the view tends to be that they're not. So that's another reason why actually you've got to have a tribunal where everything is out there on the table, because you can't rely on extracting the facts from a bank or indeed the FOS via DSAR. It's unfortunate.
Yeah, no, I wasn't actually talking about DSAR. What I do, I go to the FOS and I say, right, here's my complaint. By the way, your boss says this. When the bank responds, I want to see the bank response before we do anything else. And
fantastic.
And that's remarkable on several levels, Andy. One of them is, if they have treated your request in that way, then they've clearly been remarkably inconsistent, because I'm pretty damn sure they haven't done it with others. Please do. Yeah. Please do circulate that note. It sounds like you've made really good use of the leverage from having captured what somebody said in front of the Treasury Committee. Well done. On the well done point, well done, Mark Bishop. Thank you very much indeed. And can we please also at the same time bring to the table, as it were, Scott Henderson, who's going to spend about 5 minutes or so just talking about his family's case. Scott, just to give us all a bit of a feel for one of the cases. After Scott, we've got Andy Keats, then we've got Steve Middleton. So Scott, please do take yourself off mute and spend 5 minutes or so giving everybody a feel for your family's case. Thanks, Scott. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you as well. Just, I know we had a hotel business in the east coast of Scotland. In 1997, we looked to expand and purchased the Portree Hotel in the Isle of Skye through personal loans through RBS, which we were a new customer at the time. All was going well. 1998, we got an unsolicited approach to buy the Park Hotel in Montrose, which we initially rebuffed, but eventually we were asked to name the price, of which we did, which was 50% higher than we was valued at the year before. So obviously, as a business opportunity to look to move forward, we took it with expansion. At the October 1998, we deposited 800 or just over £1 million in RBS, which was immediately transferred to a SEBA account, which was out with our direct control. We didn't know about this for about 3-4 days, maybe a week. We had a meeting with the bank manager to pay off all loans for the Portree Hotel, Park Hotel, etc. he didn't have at that meeting the breakage fee, or sorry, the early redemption fee, but came back a week later to quote 240,000 to break a £735,000 loan at the time, which was very steep. Long story, a year later, we were into SLS, which is predecessor of GRG, and basically had everything that GRG, you know about GRG from 2008, was happening in 1998. 2002, the bank sequestrated us, and because we were a partnership, everything was taken, house, assets, etc., the hotel. We went to FOS, and probably the most unhelpful people that there were, as we mentioned, it's not transparent. They knew everything that we were doing, and we didn't know anything that they were doing. We went to court after that. Obviously, we lost the FOS, went to court, and we've discovered subsequently in 2019 that the bank had misrepresented their true position at court in 2012. Now, the reason we lost the court in 2012, which was a preliminary hearing, it wasn't an evidential hearing, was because we didn't have the funds to continue. The bank won £25,000 of caution. We had 14 days to find it. Obviously, we couldn't at the time, and probably still couldn't now, but they won. And we've discovered in 2019, through Andy Keats and SME Alliance, the setup of BBRS, the bank did a review of our case, and that was very enlightening. And actually, there was a huge amount of information that came out that, as previously said, had been destroyed. We didn't know that it existed. You can actually see the general purpose reports back in 1998, and the engineering, or what we believe is the engineering of the downfall. And there was never going to be a hope of us paying off that loan, regardless of what they were going to say. So fast forward now, we've now had bank statements that show that the bank have actually profiteered out of our sequestration. Then an agreed figure with the trustee in 2002 of 525,000, but over 1,089,000 has been paid into these bank accounts that are still trading in the personal names 10 years after sequestration. We can also show through these bank statements and the court documents that the true figure is incorrect. They were claiming £700,000 in 2012. That was corrected after the trustee produced a letter and said, look, it's 171,000. But when you look at the bank statements, they were in credit 11 months prior to that, in 2011. So even during that court process, they were still sitting with £200,000 of money in the account that they didn't pass back to the trustee, which again, they had a legal obligation to keep the trustee fully informed of all the correct figures that they have. We've been now 4 times to the bank. Obviously, the BBRS were presented with all this. We were one of the first to apply for the BBRS. They were presented with this. We went to them with 150 heads of complaint around the 2019 documentation that was released and this misrepresentation in court. They pushed us back to the FOS. The FOS in 2021 told us that, no, they can't look at us for their DISP rules. And I don't know how many people are up to date with their DISP rules, but DISP rule 2.7 is basically because we hadn't been a trading body for 17 years, they weren't going to look at us. Then DISP rule 3.3.4 is, it was said, otherwise seriously impair the effectiveness of operation of the FOS, which I don't know, but anyway, they came back, went back to BBRS. Look, there you go. BBRS cherry-picked, I believe, information. They missed out this in the eligibility. They took it up to the point of the week before that FOS gave us this information that they weren't going to look at it and cut off there. And there's many other things within that, I believe, that the BBRS cherry-picked, and again, we're probably not going to succeed in eligibility, as probably another 95% of people that went there as well. Subsequent to that, we've been to Alison Rose and pointed out the details around the court case and the bank statements. We didn't get any luck. We tried twice. We've tried our MP. He hasn't got any luck. So at the moment, we're still fighting to try and get this aired and heard, because there's clear evidence, and I believe, or we believe, that they're not willing to do it, and they won't be doing until we're kicking, screaming to court. So that's an upshot. I've tried to keep within my 5 minutes, and obviously give you a brief overview of 24 years of trying to fight RBS and going along with the FOS and the BBRS in there as well.
Scott, thank you very much indeed for setting out those things. So some of Scott's and his family's case has been in the media. If you want to, Scott, feel free to put into the chat links to things that have been in the press, because others may be interested in what you've just been saying. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. Thank you, Scott. Does anybody have anything specific for Scott relating to what he said? Otherwise, we'll move swiftly on to Andy Keats. Anything for Scott? I think we're going to be going straight to Andy Keats. So let's simultaneously thank Scott and welcome Andy back. Scott, thank you very much indeed. Andy Keats, over to you. There's been some very recent developments, Andy. Please do tell us about that. Thank you.
Yes, just before I tell you about that, I just want to say something about Scott's information, because it's really important. Scott was talking about something that happened way back in 1998. And in 2019, the information that was received then demonstrated that the bank manager in 1998 was writing a false report, internal report, about the repayment of this loan. And it doesn't matter what he said, he actually wrote something that was entirely false, provably false. It was put to the bank in 2019, and the bank came back. I said to the bank in my report, this is a falsity. You can't get away from it. It's a false statement that he's making here. And the bank came back and said, could have just been being lazy. So, and on that basis, we're not going to do anything. I just thought I'd make that point about just lengths that they go to get away, even when you've got them in a corner, still come back with something unbelievable like that. However, like you say, there have been some developments today. You received an email, did you not, which they asked you to read out. You going to read any of it out? You're on mute.
Thank you. No, I'm not going to read it out because I'm not confident. I'm not comfortable about the comprehensiveness and the accuracy of what it is I've been asked to read out. And on that basis, I'm not going to. I will circulate everything that the BBRS has given me, because if they want to say something that might be inaccurate, that's up to them. But I don't want to say what might be inaccurate at all. Thank you. So
okay, well, going on from there, then there was about, I can't remember now, 7 or 8 points that he was making, and I looked at all of those 7 and 8 points, and I thought, right, I could do an email about all of these, evidence the fact they're wrong. So you're right not to read it out. But what I did do was an email that evidence one thing that was wrong. I think it's important to share these things, because I think it's important that people understand that the BBRS has been disingenuous and an ongoing deception right from the word go, and they set out to deceive everyone that was involved in the setup, including the SME representatives and everyone thereafter, through what you might say is bullshit. It's complete and rubbish what they're coming out with. So if I share the screen, okay, can you see that? Everyone see that?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, so this was an email I sent back to BBR, or I wrote to the BBRS this morning. It was in response to the email that they'd sent you, and one of the things that they said was that case volumes. There's going to be a big row about this at some point. Case volumes, they say, and you can see it on the screen there, was frequently suggested that pre-launch estimates identified 60,000 cases would be eligible for the BBRS. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of those original estimates. 60,000 figure, listen to this, refers to a broader universe of complaints. What the hell does that mean? cases eligible for the BBRS were far fewer. Subsequent academic research from the Bayes Business School, and Mark remembers this one from the SME liaison, which was commissioned to provide a more accurate estimate of caseload and the number of potential cases to be even lower than 60,000, at 1,400 to 1,600 cases. Now, I won't go into the Bayes Business School report because I haven't got hold of it. I can demonstrate that it can't be accurate. Now, I've written below this, I remind you of my report that I wrote to the BBRS when I was an SME representative, dated the 1st of July 2020. It's a full 7 months before the BBRS went live. And the BBRS response on the 2nd of July, my further response on the 3rd of July, and then there's a further response from the BBRS, which is just below. And I've summarised all these here, so be quick. But I've said that my report points out that my research showed 2020 there were 62,000 eligible historic complaints that were being liberally quoted to the banks and UK finance, and indeed Lewis Shan Smith, the chairman of BBRS, said approximately 620 historic complaints would be there in my report, and 96.4 of them are likely to be ineligible for the BBRS based on turnover alone. This was rejected out of hand by the BBRS at the time, but how close were the figures I came up with? I said, because actually the BBRS, what I said in the email is if I could do it, so could anyone with the BBRS resources, and yet they didn't. So my analysis of the BBRS data at the moment shows that there have been 527 historic cases. And how close was I with 620 when they were claiming 62,000? And at the moment, you can actually delve down into the figures and make a case for saying that 99.2% of those cases were ineligible for one reason or another. And the biggest reason for ineligibility, although they don't say it's ineligibility because they change everything and they issue a dismissal notice instead, is that only one IP, I've got information that says that only one IP signed a dissolved complainant waiver. So irrespective of you being eligible in every other element of BBRS, if you're a dissolved company or you're in administration and your IP doesn't sign the dissolved complainant waiver, which was never produced until after the BBRS went live, you're out. That means that every single company that was dissolved or in administration has been dismissed without considering the merits of the complaint. Every single one. And I just want to say that in the parliamentary debate last week, it's very important that the very last thing that William Ragg said was that all 600 of the historic cases should be resolved. That's the aim now. We have to get 600 resolved. So if we move on to my emails back in 2020, bearing in mind I was working within the BBRS doing about 60 hours a week at the time, said, spent some time researching, this is the first one, 1st of July, sorry. I said, I've spent some time researching the reality of the BBRS scheme. It appears from the data that rather than circa 62,000 complaints, banks say are potentially eligible for the BBRS, the reality is that there are potentially only circa 620 complaints surviving in 2020, and 96.4 of them are likely to be eligible for the BBRS based on the turnover alone. I've said, this is the bit, I said this all has a potentially big impact on the BBRS historic and contemporary schemes. And if the report is accepted even partially, the banks and the BBRS will realise there are not 62,000 eligible historic complaints, or complainants, and in reality, there's a small, finite number of historic business banking complaints, circa 620, therefore under 1,000, seeking a transparent review of their complaints. If these complaints are resolved, this will mean a meaningful and will enable a line to be drawn under the past, allowing this SME community and the banks to move forward. And it is certainly an interesting proposition. That's what I put to them. Came back the next day saying, in bold, first flush, the BBRS does not agree with your conclusion eligibility will be so narrow. And you've got to remember that this is in light of the email that's been sent to Andy today, saying, oh, there was never 62,000. That was all very, very different. This is them saying, no, it is. Hold on a second. It is, Andy, you're wrong. So I wrote back to them and I said, the BBRS has only had 300 registrations of interest in the first 7 months of operation. Which was in 2020, they opened it up, not for the main scheme, but for a pilot scheme. They wanted to see how many people would apply. Said, where are the remaining 61,500 BBRS eligible complainants? Said, I'm pleased that all is not necessarily as it appears, as it was only a speculative look at what may be the case, or not what is the case. And I look forward to liaising again when the analysts have had a look at it. Because in the, sorry, I forgot to say in the previous email, they said they got 2 policy analysts starting on Monday, and Peter Taylor, who was at the BBRS then, will ask them to look at the data and method you used to draw your conclusions. So 2 young female analysts arrived at the BBRS, and I had a recorded Zoom meeting with them. I don't think they recorded, but I did. I was extremely skeptical at the time. I didn't write this in the email, but they spent half the time giggling. They're supposed to be analysts. And never heard from them again. I don't believe that the meeting was genuine. But the result of that meeting was that email on the 10th of August 2020 from John McLeod, who was the then the communications officer. He said, while we appreciate your efforts to build a picture of customers we can expect to see using the service, we are satisfied that the data contained in the appendices of the Walker Review are detailed and reliable enough to give us some foresight and act as the basis of our assumptions on case numbers. Well, that's the 62,000. That's where it comes from. So what is written to you today, Andy, is utter nonsense. Taken in the round, they say, we do not share your concerns about our eligibility criteria. Well, look, the concern at the time was that 96.4% would be ineligible, and it's actually 99.2%. Nevertheless, we will be continuing our research into our potential customer base internally, and we'll look to shine a light, increasing light, on the demand for our service later in the year as part of going live. It went live in February 2021, a resounding nothing, and there are in total 527 complaints, a historic, according to BBRS figures. Now, so, I mean, I'm not myself on the back here. We gave them this information, gave them a fairly solid report, which anyone is welcome to have, and he dismissed it out of hand. So I then went on, just briefly, to say I spent the remainder of 2020 and 2021 informing everyone that I could. The 62,000 historic complaint figure was 1, true, and 2, a deliberate ploy to avoid investigating the true 100% figure of approximately 620 historic complainants. You might think, how does that work? I said, well, they will come through the door only to be told they're ineligible for review. The banks and the BBRS's attachment, the false 62,000 eligible complaints figure, neatly provided the banks and the BBRS with a false circa 1% eligibility rate, when the 96.4%, the total historic complaints, which were 620, through 100%, were deemed ineligible. In other words, they'd say, well, look, there's all these eligible people, And 1%, the complainers, the serial complainers, they've been made ineligible because they've been resolved in the past. And everyone else is now satisfied, 62,000, even though that we haven't seen them. It's obvious that the banks have sorted them all out and everything hunky-dory. And that's what they've done here. And I've got no doubt about that at all. I knew it when I was in the BBRS, and I know it now. Also,
thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry,
If you can just bring things to a close, if you can make a concluding point, then we'll wrap up. Thank you so much. Thank you.
We've been told that the highest payout inside the BBRS, we know that the highest payout for a complainant to date is £1,200. £1,200. There are some payment frauds that have been repaid, a much bigger number than that. There are some personal guarantees that have been written off. That is the true figure. A historic complaint has had an award of £1,200, not for the complaint, but for the stress and inconvenience of them not dealing with it very well in the first place. That's it. I'm sure that is the correct figure. But that's what we're dealing with. That's it. Okay.
Andy, thank you very, very much indeed for going through those figures and your response to the email that was circulated today. It's much appreciated. Does anybody have anything specific for Andy relating to what he's just covered before we move on to Steve Middleton? Anything specific for Andy? No, in which case, thanks very much, Andy. Thank you. Well, welcome, Steve. And in doing so, one of the things I've learned to try to do over the years within TTF is to try to create a reasonably safe and civilized forum where people can share their views. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't. What really matters is understanding why each person has the views that they have, because through understanding why they have the views that they have, we can get to grips with what's really been going on. So Steve, thank you very much indeed. Please do share what you'd like to talk through with us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. And obviously, these are my views and concerns that I have, not the TTFs, but I think ones that are valid and things that should be considered. I approached the BBRS one as a victim who was defrauded by about his bank manager going back to 2007 and 8, for which I never got any justice, and the FOS would not look into or investigate my claim. Suggested that instead I take the matter to the court. So I've never had any support on that whatsoever. Secondly, I was also an advisor on a case that went through the BBRS, and I saw an appalling system of a one-sided, completely biased approach in the banks on the bank's behalf, and entirely incompetent assessors who ignored facts and evidence all the way through it. But I also come to the BBRS as somebody who's been around the issues of taking on the banks and watching others who do for probably 10 years or so now in one guise or another. And on that basis, you know, I have to disagree with Mark's position on this and sort of substantially do so. You know, Mark referred to Sun Tzu and the art of warfare. Well, he also said, to know your enemy, you must become your enemy. Now, my view is we've got to work out why something like 5 years after this scheme was mooted, we're in the mess we are, looking at what we've seen. Because in those 5 years, people have lost their homes, they've lost their businesses, they've lost their lives, there's been suicides. They're real issues. And people have had their cases timed out through limitation and lost their opportunity to litigate. And many have been badly misadvised on many, many fronts. So we have to look at what went wrong before we try and get it right. Otherwise, you know, only a fool goes into a battle after losing one badly without analysing what went wrong last time around. And so to dismiss things like the BAM as something we don't need to consider, again, I don't agree with. For those of you who are not too sure about what the BAM is, the BBRS effectively had a set of articles for the company, the BBRS company, and when they took over control, there were 3 people representing SMEs who effectively were the owners of the BBRS. They stepped down. The BBRS then took over ownership control of the company, but immediately introduced new articles of association. And in those articles, they introduced something called a bank appointed member. Now, that is a very important issue because that bank appointed member then got a power of veto. So in other words, the BBRS board could not change the eligibility or the scheme rules without the approval of the bank appointed member. Now, that was not advertised. The bank appointed member was referred to in the fine print when you looked at the rules on the website, but no one had ever mentioned it. And as that came in, my own case within the BBRS was immediately ruled out about the same time because a new eligibility criteria was brought in saying you had to have a minimum 1 million turnover. Except it wasn't a new eligibility criteria. It'd been known by the SME representatives and the BBRS for around a year at that time. We'd just not been told about it. So I submitted all of my evidence and all of my information, confidential information, to a scheme where I already could not enter the scheme but had not been told that by the SME representatives or by the BBRS, and to a scheme that was being controlled entirely in the background by the banks without being told that. I would not have provided that information. I would not have given any information or raised the issue had I known that situation. And why didn't we know it? How did that come about? Well, the bank, the BBRS themselves, you could say they were quite sly because they called a board meeting literally within days of the previous members stepping down and changed the articles in that meeting. They appointed, the original articles only allowed 3 members, the new ones straight away allowed unlimited members or more members. They appointed all of the directors as members, then they voted in this new rule. So at that point, the bank, in real terms, took control of the scheme. And the BBRS really were just simply puppets, okay? That was not disclosed. Effectively, our behaviour is actively covered up, but who's it covered up by? Who got it wrong? Now, we can't just forever and a day blame the banks for everything. SMEs got things wrong. They're still getting things wrong. There are people out there who still believe the victims who simply were bad business people. Yep. So if we're going to be credible about this, we cannot just jump up and down and shout about the bank wrongdoing or what the bank got wrong or how they approached things wrongly. How did SMEs approach this? Who approached it on their behalf? What were their qualifications? What were their expertise and experience? And how well did they do? Well, I'm sorry, but this scheme was sold to SMEs as the answer going forward. People were actively told not to pursue court cases. I remember it. Yeah, no, this will solve your problem. Yeah, trust in this, Kevin Hollingray, Heather Buchanan, the SME Alliance. Trust in this is the way forward. So that is a massive concern to me because we had a debate in Parliament the other week and somebody mentioned damp squib. I think that was a very polite way of talking about the backbench debate or what was supposed to be a backbench debate. I applaud the MPs who turned up, and I think some of them that spoke very well and spoke very honestly about situations and about some of their constituents. But the APPG on Fair Business Banking has 20 chairs and vice chairs. It has 117 MPs in membership. So why was an issue that is the issue out there for anyone who's, the people involved in this are not newcomers to this industry. These are our people who've survived a generation of lies, cheating, fraud, backstabbing and persecution by banks. That is the issue. They're the people who won't borrow from the banks. They're the people who've got no confidence, and often they're still very successful business people. Yep. So your historical, your legacy issue is the real issue here. So effectively, why did we only have 7 MPs in that room? A debate that was called at very last minute. Yeah. The debate finished before the preset time. And all it led towards was clearly a call for an enhanced FOS, certainly from the Treasury's point of view. So I've got to say, we've got to look at how do we end up in this position. Now, there's an interesting article that was put out by Sky back in earlier this year, and it was called Westminster Accounts, the next big scandal. Informal groups of MPs given 20 million from external organisations. Now, this was about APPGs. Now, obviously TTF and Andy, they have a secretariat for their banking APPG. I don't necessarily have a downside on all of them at all, but they were warning of the fact that many of them are just effectively lobbying groups. And the largest funded organisation within the APPG groups was the Fair Business Banking with 571,000 in receipts. So shouldn't it be concerning us then that 110,000 of that funding in 2018 and 19 came from the very participants that were setting up the BBRS with them at the same time? Now, okay, APPGs need funding. They've got to consider where they're doing, they'll get it from. But at the same time, you've got to also consider conflicts of interest and influence. So we had people sitting down with the banks to set up the APPG. And in theory, we are told they didn't know about this bank appointed member. So they didn't know that this organisation or this firm was going to be effectively controlled by the banks in the background. Now, I found out, or myself and Mark Wright, Bank Confidential, found out who this bank appointed member was last year, because we wrote to the BBRS and we demanded to see their register. And technically under a Section 116 application, I've never done one before, I just looked into it. They only have 5 days to respond and 5 days in which to block your application. So effectively, they could have gone to injunctors and stopped that and possibly even gone after us for costs on it. But fortunately, they never picked up my request until close of business on the 5th day. So by the time they actually rang me and thought I'd contacted the wrong organisation or didn't know what I was asking for, they were already in a position legally where they had to provide the information. And that's when they did. And we then found out the bank appointed member is exactly who I thought it would be, which was an organisation set up and controlled by the banks participating in the scheme. So a person connected to who would pay compensation out for each of those banks sits on this resolution appointed scheme member that then has the power of control over the BBRS. Now that is a huge issue. Had that been known before the BBRS started, I don't think there's one victim would have gone forward, trusted it, or put any information into it. But why didn't we know who did know? Now, when I started looking into this, I started asking a number of questions, and I was given lots of responses that told me from parties who had been involved on the ISG panel, from both the APPG and the SME Alliance, that they had no knowledge of the ban prior to September of last year, that they didn't know who it was, or they were vague about what it did or how it operated. And therefore, effectively, they believed they had the wool pulled over their eyes by the banks. Now, that's obviously concerning, because if you've got people sitting down negotiating for 2 or 3 years with expert bankers, and they managed to disguise the fact that this whole organisation is going to be controlled by the banks themselves, you've got to say, did those people have the experience or competence to undertake those negotiations? I'm not suggesting one way or another. I would say it's a concern, yeah. But what became more of a concern to me was when I was provided with information that showed that the SME ISG members did know about the bank appointed member, and that they knew that the articles were going to be changed. And in fact, they've been discussing the change in the articles for a year in December 2020. And that information came from an email from Osborne Clark, which included those panel members. And it clearly explained in that email that they would be giving away, the SME members would be giving away control to the bank appointed member, that the SME panel would only have a right to discuss or raise issues. They will have no powers of control, but the bank appointed member would. And what it said was that the SME representatives had been prepared to go along with that because they trusted that the board of the BBRS was going to be independent. Now, anybody looking at that board and the people on that board and their connections to UK finance would not for 1 second suggest that they were going to be independent. I noticed Clive put something in the chat about Lucy Armstrong. Lucy Armstrong, who was a member of the board. Lucy Armstrong is somebody who was head of the regulator for invoice finance. And we raised a concern with Clive and I about his own case, where RBS whistleblowers had confirmed that while he banked at RBS, his customer who had insured him for debt protection, this would have led to an undisclosed credit line against Clive's files, which is why he would have ended up having his overdraft reduced and his facilities removed under pressure of this additional undisclosed credit line, which effectively is fraudulent. And we went to see Lucy Armstrong about this. So we showed her, I went to show her some evidence on the credit lines and how they worked. And Clive will tell you, I remember Lucy would not look at my laptop. As I was turning my laptop around, she was moving her head away so she could not see the evidence. And what the response was because Clive had not been a customer of RBS Invoice Finance, then it wasn't a dispute they could get involved in. So we can give them evidence that RBS had committed fraud that had effectively ruined Clive's business, but because Clive was not a customer of RBS Invoice Finance, then they weren't interested in the fraud. Now, the interesting thing about that is Lucy Armstrong did not represent the banks on that panel. She represented SMEs. How did that come about? Why wasn't that questioned? How did those SME representatives on the panel sit there with her, yeah, and allow her to go on in that farce allegedly representing SMEs? So, you know, these are massive concerns for me because, you know, another Sun Tzu quote, you know, as Mark mentioned earlier, basically said, if you know the enemy and know yourself, in 100 battles you will never be in peril. If ignorant both of the enemy and yourself, you are certain in every battle to be in peril. So my concern is here that we're rushing off into the next way of doing things without analysing where it went so badly wrong in the first place. So what was suggested by William Ragg in that debate was that this would be looked at, TSC would look at it, Treasury would look at it, then they would come back to the Fair Banking APPG to discuss the concerns. Well, I'm sorry, isn't that a bit like we talk about the bank marking their own homework? Isn't that letting the people who represented the SMEs first time around, who definitely knew about this bank appointed member for a year before the scheme went live, but did not disclose that, isn't that letting them mark their own homework? So these are my concerns. This is a bit like saying, you know, we've got 100,000 Persians heading towards this gap at Thermopylae. You know, we've got about 1,000 Spartans and some of them have got to go back home. And I tell you what, let Leonidas go because he's a bit tired. You know, it doesn't really matter who really leads us. We'll let anybody take the lead. You know, the battles are won and lost by great generals and great strategy. So I think we've got to think very, very carefully about this. If there's going to be any further, this is probably the last chance saloon now for these legacy issues. We should and talk about figures. I mean, Andy's talked about the 60,000. Let me give you some real figures when it comes to victims in these matters. I've been raising issues about fixed rate loans and that 70,000 fixed rate loans have been dismissed as not regulated on the basis of analysis of one contract at Clydesdale, which is only 8,000. So 62,000 fixed rate loan victims have not been through a review, yeah, and have not been investigated. There's the 10,000 swaps that are now being raised in the JR. There's 5,000 victims at least that we know of in Ireland. There were 3 million accounts went into the asset protection scheme at RBS. Now, tens of thousands of those people had their businesses ruined. You know, we're not talking 60,000 victims here. We're talking hundreds of thousands of victims, some of whom still don't know the frauds that were perpetrated against them. So we're not, this is a huge, huge issue. And there is no appetite within Parliament to deal with this. There is no appetite within the Tories to deal with this. They've had a control of this for years. And the fact that the 7 people in that debate tells you their appetite. The only way they're going to get anywhere here is to force them into doing something. And to do that, you have to have the right people doing the right negotiations at the right level. And I know that may be a bit controversial, but that's my big concern, Andy, because I'd hate to see us do all of this all over again to end up with another debacle like we had last time.
Steve, I get it. I just want to, first of all, thank you for being as forthright with your views. You've expressed yourself firmly but fairly. You've got reason for feeling the way that you feel. And to my mind, for what it's worth, I think what you say stacks up. It really does. It seems to me that if the DNA that got us here is allowed to be the DNA that moves forward, we're going to end up repeating the same problem. Somehow, there needs to be fair, transparent representation of the victims. And that's going to be done in a credible way. If things are done behind closed doors, if things are done in a kind of matey sort of way, the risk of things going horribly wrong again is definitely there. So Steve, I think I'm on the same wavelength as you. I really am on this. And there's no reason not to try to do it the right way. There's no reason not to try to demand transparency and accountability and fairness. This is a contentious issue because people have got different perspectives on it. But fundamentally, mistakes have been made that is beyond dispute. And when you drill down to understand where those mistakes are, I find myself thinking about conflicts of interest and complicated relationships and people not being absolutely solely committed to just looking after the interests of the SMEs. And that's where my heart and soul is on this. And Steve, I'm glad that you've been so forthright with your views this evening, as you very often are. We're going to go to Richard Samuel next, who's probably going to be talking about tribunals versus FOS. That's a very, very good topic. So let's welcome Richard, whilst also thanking Steve for sharing his thoughts in such a clear, compelling, and frankly, committed way. Thank you very much, Steve. I think a lot of people want to put their hands together to thank you. Mr. Richard Samuel, over to you, sir. Spend a few minutes, if you wish, talking about tribunals, FOS, and wherever you want to take the conversation. You have a free rein, sir. Thank you for being here. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll keep it very short. I will be talking really just about tribunals because I'm the chap who really put that on the agenda by a few articles a few years ago. And when they pivoted and decided to do the BBRS, I lost interest because I knew it would go wrong. And I haven't followed the ins and outs of that because it was just a matter of time before people saw it for what it was. So I'm an unapologetic proponent of a tribunal. And, you know, listening to you now with your experience of having gone down the wrong road, you now have what seems like an opportunity to influence government in order to create a more effective solution to your access to justice problems. The only solution that's going to work for you is a tribunal, in my view. And it's quite right what's been said, that there's very little point in raking over the embers of what was, you know, a misconception in the first place. I think you want to train your sights firmly on the tribunal and go for it this time round. I'm just going to make one point which is in a sense a fresh point, which is this: that I wrote my original articles from an access to justice perspective. You know, why it was that this was necessary in order to give people with your experience justice. And obviously that's the motivation for all of you being here and having pursued what you pursued for so long, much to your credit. But you're also businessmen and businesswomen. And so what I would suggest to you is and I'm an advocate, so, you know, we approach this, you know, with different methodologies, but we approach the same thing. Is if you're trying to persuade somebody to do something, you've got your own reasons that they can do it, and those are access to justice reasons. But there are other arguments why they should do this, which are specific to them, to the people you're trying to persuade. And that understandably, that hasn't been part of any part of your reason. But if you were to create a tribunal, it would have the advantage to the people who have wronged you. And I accept that that's a massive shift in perspective to start thinking about how we can benefit the very people who we want to attack. I accept that. But if you do find a reason which benefits them and you're able to persuade them of it, then they might well be persuaded for their own reasons, for their own interests, human nature being what it is, to do the very thing that you want them to do for your reasons. And the big advantage to a tribunal would be that it creates binding precedent, case law. It applies the law, first of all, and then it creates binding precedent, which clarifies the law, which has the ability to reduce the costs of the industry, which is providing you access to capital. And so they've got a huge, at the moment they're not there. At the moment when we've had discussions with government, Griffiths and all the rest of them about trying to get a tribunal in place, it's perfectly clear, as it was last time around when we first made this proposal, that they look very much to the industry. The government looks very much to the industry to see whether they're happy with what's being proposed. And if they are, then they'll do it. If they're not, then they won't. It comes down to something pretty much as simple as that. So if you're able to persuade the industry that it should do something, then government will follow. So if you change your focus slightly and see additional reasons which would benefit the industry, you might be meet with more success. Now, I know that's a huge challenge, and it's an entirely different body of thought, on reasoning, which would get you to that conclusion. But I just throw it in there because, I don't want you going banging your head against the wall the second time round, running the same arguments where government and the industry have got in a huddle and decided that what they're doing for you is just good enough, and you're going to have to live with it. If you broaden the argument as to whether it's good enough for the industry, then they might start thinking differently. But they're a long way from that yet, in my experience. So it's one point to make, and I know it's a challenge to make that point in this group with this level of sentiment in it. But I'd throw it in there as try something different.
Richard, thank you very much indeed for sharing those thoughts and bringing a completely different and fresh perspective to it. Richard, what would and I'm not looking for advice, but what would your thoughts be about the best way to make sure that the true interests of the SMEs were properly represented, and we don't end up with some kind of huddle in the corner sorting things out for everybody else? Any thoughts about that? And you may not have an answer, but it's a very genuine question.
Well, it's I mean the inquiry that the consultation that they've set up, is about SME finance. And if you start from the premise that you want to make access to capital available to SMEs, that's your primary objective, whether you're on the side of government or you're on the side of the SME or the side of the banks, is you want a vibrant market in access to capital before you even get to the access to justice, because it's gone wrong. That's your starting point. And what you want in order to achieve that is a well-regulated, you want a marketplace which is governed by law, and there's access to justice in there, and you want a well-regulated marketplace so that it's not over-regulated and there's predictability in the regulation and the delivery of justice. That's not the case at the moment, because the regulation is opaque and the delivery of justice is random, and it's skewed. So you need to sort that out. But if you can persuade the banks that they should be part of the solution to that and create a much more lightly regulated, but clearly and precisely regulated environment, then you're going to get a huge benefit to SMEs by giving them the scale capital they're looking for and an efficient means of challenging conduct where it's necessary to do so. The two things go hand in hand for the confidence. What was created just wasn't sufficiently robust as a dispute resolution mechanism, and so it doesn't inspire any confidence. If you don't have any confidence in the dispute resolution mechanism, you're not going to have any confidence in the market. I mean, one of the obvious things that the government wants to do is create a sort of a global Britain after Brexit. And if you want to do that, you have to inspire confidence in foreign consumers of British financial services. I mean, how are you going to do that? By creating the FOS? I don't think so. A tribunal, yes, because that's something which international businesses are used to dealing with. It's very similar to arbitration. You can use your local lawyer to represent you there. You don't need to go to an expensive English law firm. That is akin to commercial arbitration, and it should be very attractive. But you've got to get those arguments across to the financial services industry for them to understand it. And you're going to create a more benign environment for SMEs if you do so. So that's the way I see it.
Richard, thank you so much. This is remarkably helpful. Richard, you may say yes or no, but don't be surprised if over the next couple of weeks we come, wanting to pick your thoughts further on some of these ideas and develop them in our submissions. Okay, thank you, Richard, very, very much indeed. Well, we're now going to go from Richard to Ned Beale. Ned, you have a few minutes if you wish to share any additional thoughts. And what we'll probably do then, folks, for those that want to carry on talking, because I can see there's quite a bit of energy around the conversation, we'll probably have a short comfort break. And for those that want to carry on nattering away, we can, okay? But Mr. Ned Beale, thank you very much for being here. Ned, over to you, please, to share your thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. It's nice to be here. I kind of feel like I was at the birth of the BBRS when the APPG were looking at this whole kind of access to justice issue quite a long time ago, and I'm now at its death. But anyway, well done for promoting the debate and the call for evidence, which really is an interesting opportunity. And I still think, looking backwards at the kind of thinking we had 5-6 years ago, it's all the reasons why we need something to fill the access to justice gap between the FOS and the court system is still absolutely there. And I must get, an inquiry every month for an SME, a business who have a, £500,000 £1 million claim against a bank, and they'll never want to litigate it, and the banks know that, and you're just stuck. And indeed, I've thought of several cases I could have sent to the BBRS, but then, as it doesn't seem to do anything, I didn't. So I really would like to think that there could be some form of tribunal that actually works, unlike the BBRS. Richard explained it really well. I would say I'm kind of neutral between a statutory court service tribunal and an arbitral tribunal. I think the key is really that it is properly neutral and making a proper judicial decision. I would say that I know there's in the BBRS there is the historic claims and the forward-looking claims. I just now think you maybe need to have a totally different solution for those two sets, and you can't get one thing to do both, just because the historical ones are so tricky with limitation, as somebody mentioned. I suppose finally to say that it's not, there's not a magic bullet for the forward-looking ones, and all of the kind of issues that Steve mentioned about credit lines and stuff, these really hard disclosure issues, expert issues. And it's not that a statutory tribunal or an arbitrator can suddenly solve all of that because we empower them to do so. But I do think there's some quite easy things about stopping banks imposing a massive cost risk on claimants that they can never really cover, and about disclosure, which we really could fix fairly simply. So I am really hopeful that there will be a way to do that, and I'll certainly be submitting evidence myself for the Treasury Committee in August.
Fantastic, Ned. Thank you very, very much indeed. For those of you that don't know, and I should have mentioned this before, Ned's with the law firm Hausfeld, the law firm that's helping the APPG on fair business banking with its judicial review against the FCA around the John Swift KC IRHP issues. And we have an event tomorrow, 6 p.m. tomorrow on Zoom. Come along to that if you have an interest in the APPG versus FCA judicial review that's underway. So we're going to have kind of two ends to this meeting. In a moment, I'm going to kind of formally end part one. For those of you that want to stick around after we've had about a minute or two comfort break, please carry on talking for another maybe 20 minutes or so. I want to give everybody the chance to get everything off their chest that they want to, because that's a very, very healthy process for a community like this to go through. There are agreements in some areas, passionate disagreements in other areas. I want to get all that out so we can function as effectively as a cohesive unit moving forward as we possibly can. So on that note, let's bring part one of this conversation to a close, and we'll have a couple of minutes comfort break, and then we'll reconvene for those that want to stay. Of course, for those of you that want to jump off at about now, the original sort of published ending time, of course, feel free to do so. If anybody wants to stay, please do stay. In the meantime, can I please invite everybody to thank all of our participants, Mark Bishop, Scott Henderson, Andy Keats, Steve Middleton, Richard Samuel and Ned Beale, who spoke just now. Can we please put our hands together and thank everybody for their forthrightness and their courage to speak what they want to talk through in the way that they've done. Well done all. Thank you very, very much.
Sure.
Folks, what we're going to do now then is we're going to kind of restart for the second part of this conversation. I very genuinely want to thank everybody for being here late, and for kind of coming back for round two. My instincts tell me that we really do need to continue this very open, candid, frank conversation. Let's try to go about it in a reasonably considerate and sensitive way. I'm very keen to give a chance for people to speak that haven't yet had a chance to do so. If you haven't yet had a chance to say what you think about the BBRS situation, now's a great time to come in. I know one or two of you are very keen to do that. So John, let's go to John Goody first of all. John, take yourself off mute and share with us whatever you'd like to share. It's about 20 to 8, folks. I propose we wrap up finally at 8 o'clock. So we've got 20 minutes or so to get off your chest. Anything else that you want to. John, over to you, sir. Thank you. And remember, we're still recording. So remember, be mindful of what you say. Thanks, John.
Of course. No, I understand. Good evening, Andy, and thank you again, and good evening to everyone. I thought the submissions were excellent, and my overall view is we've got a problem, the problem of the past, the present, and the future. I think Richard Samuel and Ned Beale hit the nail on the head. We've got to come up with positives to get our message across. However, we must not forget that people like me, like Scott Henderson, like Scott Middleton, like all the rest who are watching and listening, have suffered immense damage, and we need to get some sort of redress. And in order to do that, we need to have people like Richard Samuel and Ned Beale putting together a strong case, along with the evidence which points to what has gone wrong in the past. I can tell you very quickly, in 2019, I said to Kevin Hollenrake MP, Heather Buchanan and Nicky Turner at the SME Alliance, this cannot work, this will not work. It is based on the Walker Report. The Walker Report was sponsored by no other than the UK Finance, who are obviously the banking industry. And I quoted one chapter, which I said absolutely puts a stop to anything the BBRS is worth contemplating and supporting. And chapter 13 says that there should be no comeback if the company or the individual has been made solvent. That was enough for me, because I was already insolvent and bankrupt, and have been since 2017. I now have an appeal for permission to appeal to the Supreme Court in my own case. So I would suggest tonight that if we can think through and we can get the brains of, it would seem, lawyers, like, as I said, Richard Samuel and Ned Beale, a tribunal system, and making the argument, and this is the one argument I'll make and leave it at this, that unless banking understands, and it's going to be a very hard argument, that the best way to move forward to make profits is to have a fundamentally strong economy by investing in SMEs, we will not have a great economy. And I would add only one rejoinder. We have now built up an industry in the City of London which thrives on insolvency, the selling of debt, or as the banks would like to call it, bad debt. I am one who has suffered that. So in summation, the past we need to hang on to, because we really need some help. And we're dying at the hands of the banking industry who delay and delay. The present, we know what's going on. So let's look to the future. Let's put our case together very strongly. And to that extent, I agree with Mark Bishop that we have to go forward. But I would see the tribunal system and absolutely make sure it's not the FOSS, as we've all suffered from the FOSS in the past. That's my point.
John, thank you very much indeed for getting your points across so well. I'm starting to sort of compartmentalize my own thoughts. One way of looking at this is to think of it in terms of who and what do we trust? There has been a catastrophic collapse of trust. The businesses don't trust the banks. And there are many, many people, let's be very frank about it, there are very, very many people who don't trust those who've been involved with representing the interests of the banks. I'm just getting that out there. That's the reality of the situation. And whether it's a reality or just a perception almost doesn't matter. If there's going to be something we can all have trust and confidence in moving forward, it has to be something that is not in some way tainted with the DNA of what went before. I'm absolutely convinced of that. Otherwise, people are just going to say to themselves, here we go again. And frankly, that is, I think, the point that Steve Middleton was making in a very, in my view, in a very compelling way earlier. This is almost making me think a bit like, what Nelson Mandela did in South Africa. They went through that truth and reconciliation bit. I forget if that's the exact right phrase. It may not be, forgive me if it's wrong. But they went through that process of kind of putting their hands up to what actually went horrifically wrong. And having gone through that process, they started to rebuild the nation. And it seems to me that we haven't yet completed this process of fessing up to what was wrong. That's really important. Who else would like to come in? You've all got a chance to get whatever you want off your chest. As long as you do it in a civilized and courteous way, I really don't mind what you say. Who else would like to come in at this point? I think got Mr. Toby Chain. Sorry, is that Clive? Clive, I think you're waving your hand. Go for it, Clive. Thank you. Please take yourself off mute.
My issue with the BBRS is who decided that having jumped through many hoops as a concessionary case, and once you managed to do that, the banks had the final say. So once you'd gone through all the hoops to try and get into this, if a bank said no, that was the end of it. There's nothing you could do. I mean, I put in the chat, it's like being burgled, going to the police only to find that the police have got to ask the burglar for permission to return the goods you've had robbed. I mean, it cannot be right, this. The postmasters, imagine the postmasters sent to prison, having to go back to the post office to get their permission to have their cases reheard. Whoever set those rules in the first place, with regard to concessionary cases, it's shocking they would allow that. I mean, once you got through a concessionary case, that should be it. You should be able to go straight through mediation, straight through arbitration, straight through somewhere, so somebody can hear it, not to be closed down straight away by the banks. That's what happened to me. So that's my rant.
Thank you. Just before we go to Steve Middleton, who's put his hands up, I just want to say one more thing, if I may. Where's the Financial Conduct Authority in all of this? Where's the FCA in all of this? Have we got a situation here whereby the conduct regulator has basically washed its hands of its responsibility to make sure that people are treated properly by the banking sector? On what basis did they allow the banks to have responsibility for a voluntary redress scheme whereby they were the perpetrator, the judge and the jury? The mind boggles. The mind boggles.
I've got emails off Andrew Bailey saying that the BBRS is being set up so cases like mine can be heard. It's like Buddy Jimmy Savile saying he's coming to read us the kids a story at night. These people, there's no moral to these people. They're shocking how they can still be in their jobs. That's all I can say.
Thanks, Clive. Thank you for getting your thoughts off your chest. I think we're going to go to Steve Middleton, then to Andy Keats. And I want to include as many people who haven't yet had a chance to say what they want to say. So please, when I ask you to, don't hesitate to stick your hand up, whether that's literally or digitally. Andy Keats, sorry, Steve Middleton, then Andy Keats. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, I'm quite cynical about it, surprisingly, Andy, because it was put forward, the BBRS, as if it's going to fill this gap between those who can't get in force and they aren't big enough to go legal. So I think they were talking about something like where 90% of SMEs were covered by force, now 99% will be covered going forward, and sold all these benefits of how this will deal with future issues. And yet here we are. They've shut the legacy case down in February. They've got rid of the SME panel, and now they're shutting down the BBRS at the end of the year. And nobody's mentioning the fact, well, sorry, but this was supposed to be a long-term solution, filling that gap for SMEs. And nobody's mentioned it. What it shows it was is a cynical attempt to pretend they were dealing with the legacy cases while suggesting they were doing other than that. I can't see it any other way. It doesn't make sense. So, you know, I'm absolutely all for the tribunal system in terms of going forward. But I still think there's got to be an acceptance here that it was entirely wrong to leave this to the banks in any way. And as just been rightly said, the FCA did delegate their authority yet again, walked away, washed their hands, knowing far more about all of this than they ever let on. Yeah, and that's the bit that can't happen. There's got to be some kind of independence about how this is set up, properly analysing what it's going to deal with, what it's going to resolve, and how it's going to do that.
So, thank you, Steve. Somehow, in our responses to the Treasury Committee's consultation, we've got to make sure there's a really strong message from as many of us as possible that we need a trustworthy process used to create a trustworthy solution that's long-term. We've got to have that. We've got to have that. We'll go to Andy Keats as brief as you can, Andy. Then we're going to go to Edward Bannister, then to Toby Chambers. Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Clive, the answer to your question, when did this happen? The concessionary cases came about when Osborne Clark and who was it for them? Whoever it was who was representing the banks, I can't remember now. I'll think about it in a sec. They came about, and we put forward, the SMEs put forward a way of dealing with all cases through. We just put forward a paper, and it came back through the lawyers that this was a red line, and that if we insisted on carrying on with our requirements, the banks would walk, and the BBRS would not be set up. Now, in hindsight, we should have called them out. We didn't, and everyone panicked because the banks were going to walk, and that's how it came about. And the only other thing I was going to say is the Foskett panel has gone exactly the same way. Exactly, he was told Cranston what to do because he got it wrong, and that was a case where Lloyd's banking group, having with all those HBOS Reading people in prison for 47.5 years, then said they were going to run their own scheme, own compensation scheme. That went wrong under Griggs. Cranston said to Foskett, "This is how you're going to do it." Foskett set up. Now he's not doing it either, and he's gone completely against everything that Cranston said. That's the problem with not having people inside when these things are actually working. That's the problem, because they get sat. And there's no doubt about it. Lloyd's Bank are all over the Foskett panel.
To my mind, thank you, Andy. To my mind, the moment it was accepted that the banks would be in charge of a voluntary redress scheme that they were going to be involved with, from then on, it was the slippery slope. It was almost doomed to disaster.
They're always in charge of every resolution scheme, every single one.
But that's the bit that we must somehow fight against. That's the bit we must somehow fight against. Please do keep yourselves on mute if you're not speaking. Mr. Edward Bannister, we're going to go to you now.
Don't forget Toby.
Yeah, we'll go to Edward, then we'll go to Toby for sure. Thank you. Edward.
Thank you, Andy, for allowing me to speak. I want to thank everybody for their contributions. I think the most important thing that we all need to understand is that government and the banks are aligned as one.
Yeah.
And anybody who doesn't understand that and starts without that proposition firmly established in their head is beyond naive. The banks went bust. The government bailed them out. They bailed them out to an extent that is not appreciated by the public. They did it in ways that were entirely fraudulent, and they took the only people that were, or the only group of people that could create sufficient funds to pay for all of this were the SMEs. They couldn't attack big corporates because they would be able to fight back with their lawyers. The SMEs were unregulated. They couldn't attack the private citizen because the private citizen was the voting public. So they went for the only viable group that were big enough to solve their problem and who don't have a meaningful vote, because although there are a lot of SMEs, in proportion to the number of votes that it would cost them, it's de minimis. But the point, so I listened to what Richard Samuel had to say, and indeed Ned Beale, and I don't want to denigrate either of them because they spoke very sensibly. But the fundamental flaw in their proposition is that government is going to accept this and have an enlightened moment and decide that they should really do the right thing. They're not. They are the perpetrators. They are the sustainers of this. Andy, you mentioned the FCA a moment. The FCA is a vassal of government. The FCA is their organization. They use it as a front to pretend to offer regulation, but it is designed expressly never to go there. And it never has. And that's why we're all still here. And that's why we're all still suffering. So until we put that proposition to government and call them out, and when I say government, everybody on this call, regardless of your political view, needs to understand both Labour and Conservatives are equally steeped in this problem, because it started under Labour and it's been furthered and continued by the Conservatives. And nobody is going to address this issue until they are so scared that the public won't tolerate this anymore. That's when we get change. That's when we get justice. That's when this country can grow and its SMEs can grow, because government needs to understand that big corporates are never going to grow the economy. It's if an SME takes on one extra person, you suddenly employ 1 million more people in the economy. You can have any amounts of stimulus for big corporates, and they will never employ the same proportionate number of people, etc., etc. And all of those people are voters. And we need to establish in the government's mind, we're not interested in any more of their Mickey Mouse games. We know what they've done. We're going to call them out. We're going to put this before all the voting public. And nobody's going to, they need to understand that until they resolve this issue, nobody's going to vote for a Labour government, Keir Starmer and all the rest, or indeed for Richie Sunak and the Conservatives. It's just not going to happen. And that will terrify them. That will put the banks on the back foot, because then it becomes a question of who is most important to them. And we all know the answer to that is getting elected, because without being elected and without power, you're nowhere. And that's what we've got to do. But any messing around on the fringe, thinking, oh, if we tweak this or we tweak that or anything like that, we're going to spin our wheels just as we have in the past. And I apologize if I've offended anybody, but that's the truth as I see it.
I don't think you have offended anybody. You just spoken your mind freely and openly, and there's a hell of a lot of sense. Would your starting position, if you don't mind, folks, I think what Edwards has just covered is really, really important. Is your starting position, Edward, in your own mind, don't trust the government, don't trust the Treasury, don't trust the banks? Start off with that frame of mind first of all, and then build something from there.
Correct. And that's not a wistful. I haven't reached that position wistfully or half-heartedly. I haven't shared a lot of the research that I have done, but a few people on this call know the depth of my knowledge and understanding. And the bottom line on it is I can substantiate exactly who did what. I mean, Mr. Bailey should never be the governor of the Bank of England, because what he has done is beyond outrageous. And I need to be careful of what I say, because otherwise one appears irrational and ranting. But there is just so much wrong. And when he was at the FCA, he furthered all of this, and the current CEO was his deputy. I mean, we've discussed the revolving door of people endlessly in the past, and indeed it's been mentioned on this call. They're all this same cadre of people who facilitated these crimes and frauds and are now protecting them and continuing it. And I might add, let's not be in any way naive. Every prime minister and every chancellor since 2007/8, because believe me, the crisis was well underway long before 2008, when it finally culminated in October. We all know this. It would be naive again to suggest that it wasn't. And all of these people, right, if there were any justice, belong in jail. And that's a shocking, shocking, shocking state of affairs. And if the public come to know this, I believe genuinely it's a view they will hold, because it'll become very clear to them why there are no public services, why we can't afford a decent hospital, why we can't pay people properly, why we've got food banks in this country. The whole thing is an outrageous mess. So there we are. I am ranting a bit, so I'm going to stop. But genuinely, yeah, we've got to start with the proposition that all of those who are playing fast and loose with us are going to continue to do so, and they've done it quite intentionally from the outset, and this is all part of their game, and the BBRS was just another element of it.
Edward, thank you. Honesty is the best policy, folks. In all honesty, if I'd heard Edward say what Edward has just said when I first started the TTF back in 2015, I would have put Edward in the conspiracy theorist nut job box, right? That's where I would have put Edward's comments. My thoughts are now not that. I personally have seen enough and heard enough to absolutely convince me, apart from anything else, just read this book. I mean, apart from anything else, just read. I've heard and seen enough to know that the depth of collusion, cover-up and corruption in the system is so bad that I no longer at all think somebody speaking as Edward has just done is in the conspiracy theorist nut job box. It's
Andy, can I interrupt you?
Please do.
I used to work for Morgan Stanley, okay?
Right.
I understand banking. I was a banker. I know how it works. I know how you can manipulate it, right? If anybody, so yeah, does that make me a nutter? Yeah, possibly, because I used to be one of them, right? But the bad position from their point of view is that they can't pull the wool over my eyes because I understand exactly what they did, how it works, and all the rest of it. And in the fullness of time, I will explain that. But the time is not right, because I believe that we can make further traction behind the scenes, which is what I've been endeavoring to do, which is why I don't often speak out in the way as I have so forcefully this evening. But trust me, I know what their game is, and that should terrify them, because very bluntly, I've never heard anybody in any of these meetings explain it as I know it to be. And the moment that that gets explained and is out in the public domain, all this game is over, because the public will come to understand how they're being manipulated. And I don't think the public will stand for it from Conservatives or Labour. They'll want a complete change, because it will be seen that they are being absolutely used in support of the banks and all the rest of it. And I'm going to make one final comment. We all know that all of these politicians have very nice little non-executive jobs and other such roles. And where do they go? 99% of them end up in the finance industry. You know, it's beyond despicable.
Edward, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. I'm genuinely proud to be able to try to create a forum where people can share their thoughts in the way that they are doing so tonight. I genuinely think we're trying to create a worthwhile, say it as you see it kind of forum here. Edward, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. Mr. Toby Chambers, thank you very much for being with us, sir. Please take yourself off mute and tell us what you want to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, but speak up as you can. It's a bit soft, but speak up as you can.
I do have a kind of a health problem, actually. My voice, with my voice, when that actually came about because of my loans that got called in, and that was in 2004. But it's great that you've got this forum. One thing that in sort of preparation for the inquiry, one thing I'd like to know is, when I got that waiver letter, I was absolutely gobsmacked, and I knew as soon as I got that, if I signed it, then they would just say no, and I refused to sign it. Now, how many other people have refused to sign that waiver letter? Because their figures, they're saying, oh, we've closed all these cases, but they're only closed them because I refused to sign it because it was so biased to their side. And even if you did sign it, then too bad. And it really irked me an awful amount, that waiver letter, and also the relationship with CEDA. I find it gobsmacking to myself that you've actually got a second organisation that then's doing the mediation.
Yeah. Toby, thank you very much for being with us and sharing your thoughts. Thank you very, very much indeed. Would anybody else like to come in that hasn't yet had a chance to say what they would like to? Hubert, as succinctly as you can, please. Hubert, over to you, sir. Thank you.
Tonight's debate has been about BBRS and FOSS. I've been through the BBRS situation, an absolute load of nonsense. But worse than that, I started off with FOSS and discovered someone mentioned about being insolvent. That's where I was, and I lost out there. When I went to FOSS, I spent 2 years between FOSS and the FCA trying to get answers because I was totally ignorant of the system. Anyway, cut a long story short, my MP wrote to the bank that I am in dispute with, the Danske Bank in Belfast, and my MP wrote to Andrew Bailey, who was CEO of FOSS at the time. Andrew Bailey, in turn, wrote to Danske Bank, and Danske Bank, in turn, responded to Andrew Bailey. I have here in front of me a copy of that email from Andrew Bailey to my MP. Unfortunately, Andrew Bailey moved from FOSS to the Bank of England and never got a reply. This MP categorically asks Danske Bank 4 very damning questions as to why they did what they did to me. Now, I'm thinking of the gentleman, Scott Henderson, and it's exactly the same feeling that he's got. They totally robbed me at the last minute between funding one operation to funding a second one. And my figures stand at this moment in time between £5 and £7 million. Now, where Andrew Bailey stands in all of this, he got away without having to answer a question, and the bank also got away without having to answer a question. My case was one of the first to be done as a case study by the APPG. It was done to every MP in Westminster. They were given a copy by the 3rd of December 19 for Christmas reading, and I had a tremendous response to that, as did my MP. Now, I find it interesting that in the group that is here this evening, and evening, John, good to see you. My MP does not seem to be represented in this particular debate that took place yesterday. Now, our solicitor gentleman, Richard Samuel, I think has got it absolutely spot on. I have followed this now for over 10 years, and all I see is the association between the government, Treasury, and Treasury staff, and the FOSS, BBRS, and everybody else that is proposed to look after us. I asked Steve Middleton a question about the bank representative who represents who. And there is a trick in there that I don't think Steve has picked up on. And it has been explained to me in detail, and I believe that the bank panel have it totally set up between them, and it doesn't matter who's on the other side of the table representing the SMEs. I have been supporting the SME organizations as much as I can, and all the time that I have been out of business, and I believe that it is still being covered up, and it will be covered up, and anybody that gets in the way, I believe, will be put out of action one way or the other. Thank you very much indeed, Andy, for giving me the time. It's good to see John Guidi, because I was speaking to John Guidi the morning that John had proposed that he was going on hunger strike in Glasgow, and I tried to persuade John not to, but he went ahead with his plans, and the disgrace of the bank in Scotland, of what they did to him, is only one of so many. And Andy, it's only organizations like yours that will push this forward, and we need to increase that. And again, I go back to what our solicitor, Mr. Samuel, said, that it needs to be in greater circulation. Publicity has to be the thing that brings their attention. It was the only thing that Danske Bank responded to when I went public, and I wore a yellow vest and I stood outside their door in Belfast until they invited me in and then conned me. They conned me by proposing this. Well, first of all, they said the BBRS would never get off the ground. Secondly, they proposed a private negotiation, and they would pay all the costs. They did. And who did they pay for? They paid for the arbitrator. I lost. I found out afterwards, and I had experts look at my accounts and the reports, and Danske Bank are wrong. They are totally illegal, and I am now pressing to get to the High Court. I have no other way of doing this, and the bank have covered up so much after the event that it makes a laugh of British justice, and I want justice more than I want money. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Hubert. I think you speak for many people with your sentiment of the desire for justice. We're probably going to bring it to a close. Does anybody have anything they're absolutely itching to say? Otherwise, we'll wrap things up there. Remember, folks, two things. Tomorrow, 6 o'clock on Zoom. Alexandra put the link into the chat earlier. Use it to book yourselves on if you want to. And it's also in this week's Transparency Times. Also, we've got the 8th of August event about the responses going into the Treasury Committee. And also we've got that 13th of August deadline. Please, please, please make a mental commitment to yourselves now to respond to that consultation. And let's do the best job we possibly can. In bringing this to a close, I just want to say that if we carry on having very honest grown-up conversations with each other, we're going to increase our understanding of ourselves and each other, and finding ourselves working more and more effectively as a team of people with common interests and common goals and common objectives, and frankly, common values as well. The kind of values that don't seem to be shared by those who we are in dispute with. On that note, we'll wrap it up. Thank you all very, very much indeed for being here tonight. Thank you. We'll wrap it up there. Cheers, guys and girls. Good night all. Good night all. We'll wrap it up.